One could argue that if Nearth had not loved so completely, she would never have been quite so easy to leave. But then, if the king had owned even half the spine he wore so handsomely before his court, he would never have let anyone talk him into leaving her at all. So when a person followed the whole sorry business back to its root, the fault was his. Every last jewel of the crown she would one day wear was his fault, and his fault entirely. On the morning they cast her out, frost had come early to Drenmar, silvering the pack lands a full month before it had any right to. Nerith woke before the horns, as she always did, and lay a while in the dark of the huntsmen's quarters listening to the men breathe. She was the finest blade among them and the best tracker in 3 valleys, a low-born woman with a wolf that ran faster than any of theirs, and they had made their peace with it years ago. She had not yet made her peace with the other thing, the thing that had been growing quietly beneath her ribs since the spring, a warmth that turned toward the king whenever he entered a room, a thread that had begun, impossibly to pull. A mate bond did not consult a person's station before it chose. It had chosen anyway, and she had told no living soul, because who would believe that the king of Drenmar had been matched by the moon to a huntress who slept in the barracks? Except that he had felt it too, she knew he had. On the night of the last great hunt he had drawn her out of the torchlight, and put his mouth to her hair, and said her name, like it was the answer to a question he had carried his whole life. Soon he had told her, "Let me settle the matter of the Southern Treaty, and then I will settle us, before the whole pack, so that no one can ever again call it anything but true." She had believed him. That was the part she would never quite forgive herself for. The horns went at dawn, and a runner came for her before she had laced her second boot. "The king wants the whole pack in the great hall," the boy panted. "All of them, now." And Nearith's heart did something foolish and hopeful. The treaty, she thought. He has settled it. Today he settles us. She did not even change out of her hunting leathers. She would laugh about that later, on the road, in the way a person laughs when the only other choice is to lie down in the snow and stay there. She had gone to be claimed before the whole of her people wearing mud to the knee. The great hall of Drenmar was carved from black pine, older than the kingdom itself, and it was full to the walls when she came in. Kaelin stood on the dais beneath the antlered crown, and he looked terrible, she thought. Pale, a muscle working in the hinge of his jaw. Beside him stood Ilsa, and the sight of her friend up there was so strange and so pleasant that Nerith smiled before she could think better of it. Ilsa, who had braided her hair for the harvest dances. Ilsa, who had stood her watches for her the winter her mother died, when the grief was too raw to carry a spear. Her dearest friend in all the world, up on the dais, where the light was best. Nerith caught the king's eye across the crowded hall, and smiled at him too, small and private. Something in his face flinched away from it. That was the first cold finger down her spine. He spoke of the treaty, of the South, and of a peace bought at a price the crown was honored to pay. And then he said that the season was hard and the pack uneasy, and that a king could not go on much longer without a mate at his side to steady it. He said the name. It was not Nerith's name. It was Ilsa's. The hall roared its approval, and Nerith stood very still in her muddy leathers, while the thread beneath her ribs stretched, and drew tight enough to sing. On the dais, Ilsa would not lift her eyes. She stared at the floor as though she were willing it to open and swallow her whole. Nerith found her voice. It came steadier than she had any right to expect. "My king," she said, and the hall began to hush, because a huntress did not address the throne unbidden. "My king, there has been some mistake." Kaelin looked at her then, fully, for the first time since she had entered, and what she saw in his pale eyes was not the cruelty she would spend 3 years trying to hate him for. It was agony. It was a man drowning with his mouth clamped shut. It lived in his face for the length of a single breath, and then it was gone, sealed over. And when he spoke, his voice belonged to a stranger. "There is no mistake," he said. "You presume too much, huntress. You will be gone from Drenmar by the setting of the sun, and you will not come back." The hall went silent. Somewhere a log cracked in the great hearth, and no one flinched. He could have stopped there. He had already broken her clean through. But whatever unseen thing was driving him needed her gone past any hope of returning. And so he said the last of it, the cruelest of it, loud enough for every soul in that hall to carry the words out into the world. "Whatever you imagined grew between us," he said. "You imagined alone." They did not lay a hand on her. They did not have to. Nerith turned on her own 2 feet and walked the whole length of that hall by herself, past faces she had hunted beside and bled beside, and not one of them would meet her eyes. At the great doors, she stopped. She could not have said why she stopped. Some animal hope, perhaps. The same one that had put her in muddy leathers behind her, very low, so low that only a wolf's ears could have caught it. She heard the king draw breath as if to speak. As if there were one word more, and this one meant for her alone, and this one true. She turned back. And Kaelin looked at her across the ruin of everything, and whatever the word was, he swallowed it whole. He turned his face away. The doors of Drenmar opened at her back onto a white and freezing world, and Nerith walked out into it with nothing at all, and the thread beneath her ribs snapped clean. She would not understand for 3 long years what it had cost him to send her into the cold. That morning, she understood only that the man she loved had thrown her away the instant another woman was set before him. And she carried that understanding out into the snow, like a blade lodged somewhere no healer could ever reach. It was, as she would one day learn, exactly what she had been meant to carry. Exile is not a single act. That is the cruelty no one warns a person about. It is not the great doors closing behind you. It is the long, grim parade of mornings after, each one leaning over your bedroll to ask the same question, which is, why are you still walking, and never once offering an answer good enough to believe. Nerith walked south, because south was away, and away was the only direction that meant anything now. Drenmar gave way to the broken country along its border, and the broken country gave way to the failing roads of Vera, a kingdom she knew only from old stories. A once great southern realm gone thin and gray, its fields half-worked, its lords forever squabbling over the bones of a crown that had sat empty for a generation. A dying place. It suited her well enough. She had the strange sense of a woman walking deeper and deeper into a mirror of her own chest. She hunted what little the frozen woods would give her, and slept where the wind could not find her. And at night, when the cold would not let her rest, she turned the thing over and over, the way a tongue goes back to a broken tooth. She had been a fool. That was the plain shape of it. She had let herself believe that a bond meant she was wanted when all a bond had ever made her was useful and warm and near to hand. Kaelin had kept her close, right up until the hour another woman was placed before him, and then he had chosen, and he had not even had to think long about it. That was the part that scoured her raw, not that he had let her go. That he had let her go so easily. Second, she thought, one boot in front of the other. You were always going to be second. You had simply not yet met the woman you would come second to, and her name was Ilsa, and she had braided your hair. By the 10th day her snares came up empty, and by the 12th the strength went out of her legs on a long open stretch of the southern road. She did not so much decide to fall as simply arrive at the ground. One moment, she was walking the frozen ruts, and the next, the wide white sky hung above her, and the cold was in her spine and her body had stopped taking her orders. She thought, without much feeling about it at all, that this was likely where it ended, and that there were worse places to end than a quiet road beneath an enormous sky. Then there were wheels. She heard them before she saw them, the particular grind of an iron rim over frozen mud, and it was wrong, because it was far too fine a sound for so poor a road. A carriage of real quality, black and lacquered, drawn by 2 gray horses whose breath smoked in the cold. It slowed. It stopped. Nerith lay in the ruts and watched a polished door swing open as if from very far away. The man who stepped down was old in the way of standing stones, weathered, but wholly unmoved by weather, silver hair, a coat worth more than every bed she had ever slept in, and eyes, the pale and patient color of a winter sky. He crossed to where she lay and looked down at her, and there was no pity in his face. She would remember that afterward. Of all the things she would remember, she would return most often to the fact that there had been no pity in it at all, only a quiet, arithmetical satisfaction, as though he had come at last to the end of a long sum, and found it balanced. "Well," he said, "you are a very great distance from where you ought to be." Nerith tried to speak, and managed nothing. "Do not trouble yourself," he went on, crouching with the care of an old man's knees. "My name is Caldus. I am, for my many sins, the chancellor of this tired little kingdom. And I have been searching for you, child, for a good deal longer than you have been alive." That reached her through the cold. Searching for her. No one had ever come searching for her. She had been, her whole life, the one who did the finding. "You wear the old blood of Vera in your face," Caldus said softly. "The true line, the one they all swore had died in the burning. I have spent 30 years chasing a rumor of it across 2 kingdoms, and here it is, freezing to death in a ditch, dressed in the mud of Drenmar." He very nearly smiled. "Someone, it seems, has thrown away a queen." Nerith's cracked lips shaped a single word. Queen. It made no sense. Nothing made sense. "Rest now," the old man said, and lifted one hand, and there were servants and warm arms taking her weight and carrying her toward the deep upholstered dark of the carriage. "You have a very great deal of work ahead of you, and I intend to see every last part of it done. This realm has waited long enough for its rightful crown." The door closed. The last thing Nerith saw, before the warmth pulled her under, was the Chancellor's pale eyes, watching her with enormous patience, the way a careful man watches a snare he set long ago at last, and gently begin to close. 3 years is time enough to raise a kingdom out of its own ashes, provided a person is willing to be ruthless about it. Nerith had uncovered in herself a remarkable capacity for ruthlessness. She thought sometimes that Drenmar had given her that much, if it had given her nothing else. A woman who has already been thrown away has very little left in the world to fear. They called her the Winter Queen, now, throughout the South, and they did not mean it unkindly. The fields of Vera were worked to their edges again. The granaries stood full against the cold months, the roads were mended, and the squabbling lords who had picked at the empty throne for a generation had learned one by one that the huntress beneath the crown could read a false ledger at 40 paces and would not be charmed, flattered, or waited out. She had brought a dying realm back to its feet, with the same patience she had once used to track a wounded stag across a mountain, slowly, completely, without ever once losing the trail. She had not softened. That was the thing her court could never quite decide how to feel about. She still walked the walls herself in the small hours, still knew the count of grain in the eastern stores better than the steward did, still kept a blade within reach of the throne, and her boots broken in for running. The crown had not made her a different woman. It had simply given the woman she already was a very long reach. On the morning it all began again, she was hearing petitions in the pale stone hall, and she was doing it well, and she was bored nearly to tears. A dispute over a mill. A widow cheated of her husband's pension by a cousin who had not expected the queen to do the arithmetic aloud. Nerith settled them both, plainly and in favor of the people who had actually been wronged, and old Caldus stood at her right shoulder throughout, murmuring the names of lords and the weight of their grudges into her ear. It was Pell who brought the news, breathless, the way that earnest young man brought all news. "Your Majesty," he said, and then had to stop and catch himself. "An envoy. From the north. From Drenmar." Something moved through the hall like a draft under a door. Beside her, Nerith felt the Chancellor go very still, and she noted it, the way she noted everything now. Caldus had spent 3 years steering her gaze anywhere but north. She had assumed it was the ordinary caution of a small realm toward a larger one. She was no longer entirely sure. Drenmar, she repeated, and was proud of how level it came out. And what does Drenmar want with us? An alliance. Your Majesty, Pell said. Their king has come himself to ask it. In person. He waits at the door. Their king, in person. Kings did not come themselves to ask for anything. Kings sent men to ask, so that a king need never stand in a room and be told no. That Kaelin had come in the flesh meant Drenmar was in far deeper trouble than the North admitted, and some cold and governing part of Nerith filed that fact away, even as the rest of her went strangely quiet. Beside her, Caldus leaned in. Majesty, he said, low and smooth, this can wait. The North is a nest of wolves and old grievances. Let me receive the man and learn his measure before you trouble yourself with him. And a year ago, even a month ago, she might have let him. But there was a note under his ease that she did not like, a hand pressing gently on the scale, and Nerith had grown allergic to being managed. No, she said. Bring him in. I find I should like to see what the North has become. Wenna, at the foot of the dais, caught her eye and lifted one eyebrow, the exact, careful distance that meant are you certain, and Nerith gave her the smallest shake of her head that meant leave it. The great doors of Vera swung open. She had rehearsed nothing, because she had not known there was anything to rehearse, and so she was entirely undefended when Kaelin walked into her hall. He was older. That was the first foolish thought, and it arrived before any of the others. Older and worn, thinner than a king ought to be, gray coming in at his temples that had not been there before, and he came up the long stone hall with a delegation at his back and the weight of some desperate errand on his shoulders, his eyes already lifting to the throne to find the famed Winter Queen who might yet save his kingdom. He found her face instead. He stopped. He simply stopped. In the middle of her hall, as though he had walked into a wall no one else could see, the color went out of him. The delegation behind him rippled and halted in confusion. And Nerith sat very straight beneath the crown of a realm he had never once imagined her wearing, and watched 3 years of careful, ruthless composure become the only thing standing between her and the floor. Kaelin's mouth opened. Whatever kingly greeting he had prepared was gone, scattered, and what came out instead was a single word, cracked straight down its middle, spoken not to a queen at all, but to a ghost he had made with his own 2 hands, Nerith. And from the high stone throne of Vera, the woman he had thrown away into the snow, looked down at the king who had done it, and let the silence stretch, and did not offer him a single thing. There is a particular power in being the one who gets to decide whether the conversation happens at all. Nerith had learned it slowly over 3 years of watching men who had never in their lives been made to wait discover that a queen could make them wait as long as she pleased. She had not known, until Kaelin stood cracked open in the middle of her hall, how much she was going to enjoy it. She let the silence run until it grew teeth. She let it run until the delegation behind him shifted on their feet, until Pell glanced anxiously between them, until the whole hall understood that the King of Drenmar had spoken the Queen's name like a plea, and the Queen had not troubled herself to notice. Then, and only then, she spoke. "You have ridden a very long way," she said, "to a realm your kingdom has ignored for a generation." Her voice was cool and clear, and carried to every corner of the stone. "I confess myself curious what could possibly have grown so urgent in the North that a king would come south himself to beg it." The word beg landed exactly where she had aimed it. She saw him take it. To his credit, he did not flinch from it the way a lesser man would have. "Your Majesty," Kaelin said, and his voice had steadied, though it cost him something to steady it. "Drenmar comes not to beg, but to propose." And then he stopped, because propose was the wrong word, and they both heard how wrong it was, and for one appalling moment the whole ruined history between them hung in the air of that formal room like smoke. Beside her, Caldus moved smoothly into the gap. Perhaps, he said, the king of Drenmar would care to state his business plainly, so that Her Majesty need not spend her morning untangling northern courtesies. His tone was mild and helpful and entirely poisonous, and Nerith watched Kaelin's eyes go to the old man for the first time and narrow by a fraction. The business was quickly told. Once it was told plainly. Drenmar was starving. 3 hard winters had gutted the north. The game had thinned to nothing, and a blight had taken the little grain the cold had spared. Kaelin's proud kingdom, the kingdom that had cast a huntress into the snow, rather than be seen to bend, had come at last to the one realm in the world with granaries full enough to save it, Feyre, the dying kingdom that had refused to die. I ask an alliance, Kaelin said. Grain through the winter, and the roads kept open, in exchange for whatever the north can offer that the south might want. Steel, timber, the northern passes held against Sorn. He paused. And I ask it of you, your majesty, because there is no one else left to ask. It was, Nerith thought, a very good speech, made better by the fact that every word of it was plainly true. 3 years ago she would have been undone by the sight of him laid this low. She was surprised and a little unsettled to find that some small and unregenerate part of her was undone by it still. She did not let it reach her face. I will consider it, she said. My chancellor will see your people housed. We will speak of terms tomorrow, and the day after, and however many days it takes. To be certain, the north cannot cheat us. You will find, King Kaelin, that Feyre counts everything twice now. We learned the hard way what it cost to trust the wrong people. She had not meant the last of it to be personal. It came out personal anyway, and she saw it strike him clean through, and she was not entirely sorry. Later, when the hall had cleared and the northern delegation led away to their cold guest wing, Caldus lingered at her shoulder as he always did. Majesty, he said, quietly, you will not seriously entertain this. They are starving. Caldus. They are starving, and we have more grain than we can eat. A queen who lets a kingdom die at her door, when she might have saved it, is not a queen anyone should follow. The old man's pale eyes rested on her, with that patient arithmetical weight she had never fully learned to read. There is more here than grain, he said. That man threw you into the snow, child. I found you dying in a ditch because of him. He watched her, carefully, as he said it. The way a man watches a fire he has just fed, a creature that has bitten you once, does not deserve the chance to do it twice. Keep him at arm's length. Take his steel if you must, but do not let him near you. He is not to be trusted, and neither, I think, is the reason he has really come. It was sound advice, the advice a loyal chancellor ought to give, and Nerith would have taken it without a second thought, except that some wary instinct, sharpened on years of reading false ledgers, noticed how much Caldus wanted her to take it. How neatly the old wound served the old man's purpose. Keep him at arm's length. Let me stand between you. Do not, whatever you do, let the two of you compare your accounts of that morning in the snow. She said none of this. She had learned to keep her own counsel until she knew the full shape of a thing. I hear you, she told him, which was not the same as I agree, and dismissed him for the night. She thought that was the end of it. She was crossing the dark colonnade toward her own chambers, alone, the way she still insisted on going everywhere, when a figure detached itself from the shadow of a pillar, and she had her knife half drawn before she saw the gray at his temples. Kaelin lifted both hands, slow, palms open. I know, he said. I know I have no right to be here. I could not make it through the audience. I had to see you where there was no one watching either of us. You should not be in this corridor, she said. Her voice came out steadier than her pulse. I know that too. He did not move toward her. He stood in the cold and looked at her as though he were trying to memorize the changes 3 years had written, and something in the looking made the old snapped thread beneath her ribs ache in a way it had no right to ache anymore. I have imagined 1,000 times what I would say if the moon were ever cruel enough to put us in a room again, he said, And now here you are, a queen, and every word of it has left me. Then we have nothing to discuss, she said, and made to pass him. He did not reach for her, he only said her name. But he said it the way he had said it once in the torchlight of the last great hunt, low and undone, like it was the answer to a question he had carried his whole life, and the sound of it stopped Neareth where she stood, as surely as a hand around her wrist. 3 years of ruthless, careful composure, and one broken syllable in an old familiar voice, reached straight past all of it, and closed around something she had been certain was long since scar. She did not turn around. She did not trust her face to turn around, and so she stood there in the freezing dark, with her back to the only man who had ever managed to unmake her, and hated with her whole heart, that after everything, she still wanted to answer. She agreed to the alliance in the morning, and she told herself it was because a good queen does not let a kingdom starve. This was true. It was simply not the whole of the truth, and Nerith had grown too honest with herself, on the long road out of Drenmar, to pretend otherwise, for very long. The terms took days, as she had promised they would. She sat across the treaty table from Kaelin, through the short grey afternoons, and Caldus sat at her right hand, counting every clause twice, and slowly. Against every intention she had carried into the room, the old thing came back. Not the wanting. She had braced for the wanting. What she had not braced for was the work, because they were good at this together. They always had been, though she had been too young and too in love to notice it the first time. He would push a hard demand, and she would see 3 moves past it, and he would catch her seeing it and adjust, before she had to say a word. And the treaty grew clause by clause into something better than either of them would have built alone. When a dispute over the northern passes snarled the whole afternoon into knots, it was Nerith who cut it plainly, the way she cut everything, and she looked up to find Kaelin watching her untangle it with an expression that was not desire at all. It was something worse. It was pride, as though her cleverness were a thing he had always known was in her, and was helplessly glad to see the world finally forced to reckon with. She looked back down at the map, before it could do her any damage. It was on the 4th evening that they tried to kill her. She would work it out afterward, the how of it. The old orchard below the eastern wall had been let go wild in the lean years and never properly watched. She and Kaelin had walked out onto the wall after the day's work, not by arrangement, only because they had both risen from the table at the same moment, and neither had found a way to say goodnight, and the cold air was a relief after the close warmth of the council room. He was mid-sentence, some dry remark about the passes, and easing between them, she had not permitted in 3 years. And Nerith's wolf, which had lain quiet beneath her crown for so long she had half forgotten it, came awake all at once with every hackle raised. She heard the string before she saw the shape of it. A single wrong sound in the dark of the orchard, taut leather and iron, an old instinct threw her sideways off the line of it without waiting for her permission. But she threw herself the wrong way. She threw herself toward the wall, toward safety, and left the whole open length of herself, exposed to the trees, and the bolt was already loosed, and coming for the space where a queen's heart had been. She did not save herself. He saved her. Kaelin moved faster than a man that size had any right to move, and he put his own body across hers, and took her down to the cold stone of the wall walk, with his arms wrapped around her head. The bolt went where he had been standing. It buried itself in the old timber of the parapet with a sound like a fist through a door, close enough that she felt the wind of it in her hair. For a moment, there was only the 2 of them on the stone, and his heart slamming against her back, and his arms locked around her as though he meant to hold the whole night off her by force. Then the guards were shouting, and torches were flaring along the wall, and Wenna was there, with her sword out roaring orders into the dark, and the moment broke. Nerith got herself up. Her hands, she noted with distant professional interest, were not quite steady. Kaelin rose more slowly, and she saw why the bolt had not missed him clean. It had opened a long, shallow furrow down the outside of his arm on its way past, and the blood came dark through the torn sleeve, and he had not made a single sound about it. "You are hurt?" she said. "It is nothing," he said, which she already knew was a lie, because she had heard him say precisely those words the last time, 3 years ago in a hall in the north, in a voice pretending to be a stranger's. Her wolf remembered, even if the rest of her had tried to forget. She should have been running the wall. She should have been ordering the orchard swept, and the guest wings sealed, and the whole business turned over to the captains. Instead, she stood in the torchlight and looked at the blood on his arm, and heard herself ask the wrong question entirely. "You are not surprised," she said. Kaelin went still. "Someone loosed a warbolt at your host queen from 30 paces, she said slowly, "and you covered me before the string had finished singing. You did not freeze. You did not gape. You knew it was coming." She took a step toward him, and the queen in her was fully awake now, cold and reading him like a false ledger. "This is not the first time someone has tried this, is it? You came south already, waiting for it." For half a breath, something surfaced in his face, something raw and cornered and afraid. Not for himself, she realized, but for her. Then he closed it over, the same way he had closed his face in that hall 3 years ago. The same seam sealing shut, and the sight of that old familiar shutting did more to chill her than the bolt had. "Let it wait until morning," he said quietly. "You are cold, and I am bleeding on your very fine wall." She let him deflect her, because Wenna was calling and the night needed running. But, as the guard swept the dark orchard and found, of course, nothing. Nerith stood on the wall with the wind cutting through her, and began, quietly and methodically, to keep score. He had known. He had come south into a starving alliance, already braced for a blade. Someone wanted her dead, or wanted him dead, or wanted the two kingdoms at each other's throats. And Kaelin of Drenmar knew far more about the reason than a simple starving supplicant had any business knowing. The list of things that did not fit the story she had told herself for 3 years was growing longer by the hour, and Nerith had never in her life been able to leave a trail unfollowed. She told herself over the days that followed that she was watching him for danger. It was even partly true. A wise queen kept a close eye on a man who caught bolts too calmly. She interviewed him the way she interviewed a suspect ledger, circling patient, waiting for the number that would not reconcile. The trouble was that the more she watched Kaelin for danger, the more she simply watched Kaelin. He would not be pinned down about the past. That she discovered quickly. She would set a question about the north, about the winters, about who might want her dead, and he would answer the danger honestly enough. But the moment she turned the question toward that morning in the hall 3 years ago, he slid away from it with a grace that would have impressed her if it had not enraged her. He would go, dry and clever, ask after the running of her granaries, and 3 questions later, she would realize the subject had moved, and the thing she had been reaching for was gone. "He is hiding something," she wrote in the private ledger of her own mind, and could not for her life decide whether it frightened her or not. Because, in between the deflections, something else was happening, and it crept up on her the way the cold crept into a house, one unnoticed degree at a time. He brought her the Eastern grain counts himself one morning, unasked, having spent half the night going through them because she had mentioned once that the Eastern steward's figures never quite sat right. He had found the error. Of course, he had found the error. He set it before her with the careful diffidence of a man offering something to a creature that might bolt. And Nerith looked at the corrected column and had to turn away so he would not see her face. No one had ever done her work with her. Every soul who had ever valued her had valued her for what she could do for them. Kaelin sat across a table in the small hours and did the tedious work beside her for no reason at all, except that it was hers, and it undid her far more thoroughly than any bolt in the dark. It broke on the 7th night, in the map room, alone. He had come with no ledger and no question. He had simply come, and sat across from her in the lamplight, and after a while, she put down her pen, because she could not read a single figure with him looking at her like that. "Why are you here?" she said. And she did not mean in the map room. Kaelin was quiet for a moment. Because Drenmar is starving, he said. That is why your kingdom is here. She held his eyes. I asked why you are. He looked at her for a long time, and she watched him arrive at the edge of something true, watched the words gather themselves in his throat, watched him lift them almost all the way to speaking. And then, at the very last, she watched him swallow them whole, exactly as he had swallowed the word he owed her in the doorway of that northern hall, and something in her that had been holding a small and stupid hope simply gave out. Do not, she said, and her voice cracked straight across the middle of it, and she let it. Do not sit in my map room in the middle of the night and look at me like that and then say nothing. I have had 3 years of nothing. I built a kingdom out of the nothing you left me. I have earned better than to be looked at and lied to by silence. Nerith, he said, you threw me into the snow. She was on her feet now, and the thing she had bricked up for so long was coming down brick by brick, and she could not stop it. You stood in front of your whole pack and told me I had imagined every moment between us, and you did it the same hour a better woman was set before you, and I believed you. That is the part I cannot forgive. Not you, me. I believed I was worth keeping, right up until the moment you showed the whole world I was not. The silence after that was terrible. And then Kaelin stood, slowly, and crossed to her, and did not touch her, only stood close enough that she had to tip her chin to hold his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice had gone rough and low and stripped clean of every kingly thing. Is that what you have carried? He said. All this time. That you were the one found wanting, she could not answer. Her throat had closed. Then hear one true thing from me tonight, he said, and I will not ask you to believe it, only to hold it. Whatever you have told yourself all this while, whatever that morning made you think you were. He stopped, and she watched the cost of it move across his face. You were never the one who walked away, Nerith. Not that morning. Not for one single day of the 3 years since. And before she could seize it, before she could take hold of the words and demand the whole of what lay beneath them, he stepped back into the dark of the doorway and was gone, and left her standing alone in the lamplight with her whole careful history quietly coming apart in her hands. A person cannot unhear a thing like that. Nerith tried. For 3 days, after the map room, she buried herself in the treaty, and the granary counts, and the ordinary running of a kingdom, and every one of those 3 days the sentence sat in her chest where the snapped thread used to be. You were never the one who walked away, not that morning, not for one day of the 3 years since. It was a lie, she told herself. It had to be a lie, because if it was true, then the whole architecture she had built her new life upon, the certainty that she had been weighed and found wanting, came down, and she did not know what she would be standing on if it did. She went to him on the 4th night. She told herself it was to press him, to corner the truth out of him, the way she cornered a false ledger. She believed that right up until she stood at the door of his borrowed chambers, with her hand raised to knock, and then she stopped believing it, and knocked, anyway. He opened the door and went still at the sight of her. Behind him the fire had burned low, and the room was warm and gold and quiet, and there was no court to perform for, and no chancellor at her shoulder counting, and no crown between them but the one she had left, deliberately, on its stand. You said, I never walked away, she said. Her voice was not steady, and she had stopped pretending it would be. Then tell me what I did do. Tell me plainly, without sliding out of it, or so help me, I will go back to hating you, because hating you is the only thing these 3 years that has ever let me sleep. Kaelin looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him weigh some terrible sum behind his eyes, and she braced for him to swallow it again, to turn his face away as he always did. I cannot tell you all of it, he said, low. Not yet. There are lives that hang on the not yet, and one of them is yours, and I will not spend your life to ease my own conscience. He took a breath. But I can tell you this much and swear it on the moon that bound us. I never once found you wanting, not for an hour. Whatever you have carried, whatever that morning taught you to believe about your worth, it was the cruelest lie I have ever told, and I told it on purpose, and I have hated myself for it every single day since. The room was very quiet. The fire ticked in the grate. Why? She whispered. To keep you alive, he said, and his voice broke clean across it. That is the one true word I can give you tonight. Everything I did that morning, I did to keep you breathing. And it worked, and you lived, and you built all of this. And I would do it again. And it is still the worst thing I have ever done. She should have kept pressing. Some cold governing part of her knew there was more, knew the shape of a larger truth still hidden behind the not yet, and knew that a wiser queen would have stayed on the trail, but she was not, in that moment, a queen. She was a woman who had spent those long years, believing she was the sort of thing a person threw away, and here was the man who had thrown her, telling her with his whole ruined face that it had been a lie, and something in her that had been clenched shut for 3 winters. She crossed the room. She did not decide to. She arrived. And Kaelin made a sound like a man who had been holding his breath for years and caught her face in both hands as though she might dissolve. And when he kissed her, it was nothing like the careful kings and the careful courts. It was the two of them, and the low fire, and the old bond stirring beneath her ribs, like something waking that had only been sleeping after all. And underneath all of it, threaded through every other feeling, was the one she had never once in her life been given. Not want for her sword, or her tracking, or her blood, or her crown. Just want for her. Plain and helpless, and asking nothing back. She had been useful to everyone who had ever kept her. She had never, until this man's hands, been simply wanted, and it undid her more completely than any grief. Later, with the fire burned low and her head resting against his shoulder, and his heart steady under her hand, he spoke without meaning to, half asleep, his guard down for the first time in 3 years. I told them it would kill me, he murmured into her hair, when they made me send you away. I told them there was no treaty worth it, and they said, he stopped. They said what? She said, gone very still against him. But he had caught himself. Even in the dark, even undone, nothing, he said, old ghosts, sleep. And Neareth lay awake against the warmth of him with her heart going hard and slow, because she had heard it now, the seam of it. When they made me send you away, someone had made him. Someone had stood in that northern hall 3 years ago and set the whole cruelty in motion. And Kaelin's account of that morning, and the account she had carried for 3 years, did not match, could not both be true. One of them had been lied to. And she was no longer at all certain it was her. The alliance was sealed on the last night of the Frost Fair, and Vera threw open its restored halls to celebrate it, and for a few golden hours, Nerith let herself forget that she was hunting anything at all. She had stood guard at the edges of 100 feasts in her old life, watching other people belong. She had never once been the reason for one. Now her whole court and half of Kaelin's turned out, beneath the mended rafters, and there was music, and the granaries were full, and a starving kingdom in the north would live through the winter because of a treaty she had built with her own 2 hands. Kaelin found her across the crowded floor and smiled, slow and private, the way he had that morning 3 years gone, before everything broke, and the warmth of it reached across the hall. You look, he said, when he had made his way to her side, like a woman who has forgotten to be suspicious of me. Do not grow accustomed to it, she said, but her voice had gone soft, and he heard it, and the hope that moved across his face was almost more than she could bear to look at. He drew her out onto the gallery, where the music thinned. For a while neither of them spoke. Below them, the fair spread out in torchlight. Across the courtyard she had rebuilt from rubble. You hate this, she said, watching him. The feast, the performing. I can tell. He laughed, surprised out of himself. Am I so easy to read after all this time? To me, she said, only ever to me. The laughter went out of him gently, and what was left underneath was tired in a way she recognized, because she had worn the same tiredness on her own face for so long. "I have been the king they needed since I was 19, he said. Strong when they were afraid, certain when there was nothing to be certain of, never once allowed to be the frightened boy under the antlered crown, because a frightened king is a dead king, and a dead king cannot protect a single soul." He looked at her. "I got very good at wearing the face they needed. Good enough that I fooled the one person I would have given anything to be honest with." She reached up, without deciding to, and laid her hand against his jaw, the way she had let herself touch no one at all. And the moment her skin met his, the bond she had believed snapped came roaring back to life. It was not a memory of feeling. It was feeling, his feeling, pouring through the place where they touched. Distinct and foreign and undeniable. Grief and hope and a love so vast and so long-starved that it staggered her. It had never snapped at all. It had only gone dormant, waiting, because a true bond does not break when one wolf lies to another. It only sleeps, and a sleeping bond meant that every hard truth she had built her exile upon was wrong, and it was all too much, too fast. 3 years of certainty collapsing in a single breath. Nerith jerked her hand back as though burned. Kaelin's eyes went wide. "You felt it," he said, and his voice was raw with something that had waited 3 years to be spoken. "Nerith, the bond, it never." "It was nothing," she heard herself say, "a trick of the wine." "Nothing," he repeated. The word landed on him like a slap, and she watched the hope she had put in his face crumble and seal over, and she hated herself even as she did it, because she was not ready. She could not be ready to be that wanted, and to have believed the opposite for so long. A servant appeared at the gallery's edge with a tray, 2 cups of dark spiced wine glinting in the torchlight, and murmured her title and offered it. And Kaelin, wounded and distant now, reached to take one. And Nerith's wolf, still awake, still raised from the touch, snarled. She did not think. Her hand shot out and struck the cup from his fingers before it reached his lips. It shattered on the stone and the wine ran black across the flags, and she was already down in a crouch over it, and the smell rose up sharp beneath the spice and the oak. Bitter, wrong, a killing thing. "Do not touch it," she said, and her voice did not sound like her own, Nightshade, or a cousin of it. Enough to bring down even an Altha. She looked up at him from the wreckage of the cup, and the color had gone out of his face. "If you had reached this feast, a moment less loved," she thought, and could not finish the thought. "Get up," Kaelin said, low and urgent, and pulled her to her feet, and his eyes swept the gallery, the doors, the retreating back of the servant already lost in the crowd. "Say nothing." His hand closed hard around her wrist. "Not to your court, not to the captains." He paused, and something careful and deliberate came into his voice. "And above all, not to your chancellor. Not to Caldus. Do you understand me?" "No one." She stared at him. The whole feast roared on below them, oblivious. "Promise me," he said. "Just this once. Trust me, and tell no one, least of all the old man. There is a reason. I swear to you, there is a reason, and if I am right, telling the wrong person is the one thing that gets you killed." Every instinct she owned screamed that a queen does not hide an attempt on her own life. That a queen sweeps the hall and seals the gates and turns the palace inside out. And every instinct also noticed, cold and clear, the one name he had reached for, not the captains, not the court, Caldus. He had named Caldus specifically, and a starving king, with no stake in her chancellor, had no reason to fear that particular old man, unless he knew something about him that she did not. "All right," she heard herself say. Against every instinct she had, "I promise. I will tell no one." Relief and fear warred in his face. And Nerith stood in the spilled poison with her wrist in his hand, and understood that she had just agreed to keep a secret from the one man who had held her whole kingdom in his palm all this time, and that she had done it because, without quite letting herself know it yet, she had already begun to suspect him. She kept the promise for exactly 2 days. Then she broke it, the way she had always broken every leash anyone ever tried to put on her, because she had promised to tell no one, and she had not promised to stop hunting. She hunted the way she knew how, quietly, at the edges, in the small hours. And on the second night her hunting took her, not to Kaelin, but after him, because she woke to the bond, humming low and troubled, and knew he was awake and moving somewhere in the sleeping palace, and she rose and followed the thread of him through the dark corridors. It led her to the one place in Vera she would never have looked, the Chancellor's archive. The long, cold room where Caldus kept 30 years of the kingdom's records, and where the old man had told her, more than once and always gently, that a queen's time was too precious to be spent among such dust. The door stood ajar. Inside, by the light of a single shuttered lamp, Kaelin stood at Caldus's great desk with a sheaf of old papers in his hands, and his face, when he looked up and saw her in the doorway, was the face of a man caught at the exact worst moment of his life. "Nerith," he said, "this is not what it appears to be. You are going through my Chancellor's private papers," she said, very quietly, in the dark, in the middle of the night. Having sworn me to silence not 2 days past, she stepped inside. "So I think it is precisely what it appears to be. And I think you are going to tell me the whole of the not yet right now, or I am going to call the guard and let them decide what it appears to be." He set the papers down. She watched him choose, watched the last of the careful king fall away, and what was left was only a tired man who had carried a thing too heavy for too long and had, at last, run out of road. "3 years ago," he said, "a man came to me in the north, a southern man, silver-haired, patient. He came to me privately, and he told me 2 things, and he had the proof of both. He told me that the huntress I had bound myself to in secret, the woman the moon had chosen for me, was the last living heir of the old line of Vira. And he told me that if I claimed you, if I made you my queen and set that blood beside my crown, there were 3 southern houses that would see it as a claim on their throne, and would have you killed before the year turned." He looked at her. He showed me the men. He showed me the coin, already paid. It was not a threat. It was a schedule. The cold that came over Nerith then had nothing to do with the archive. "He gave me a choice," Kaelin went on, and his voice had gone hoarse. "Claim you, and you die, quickly. And Drenmar with you when the south moves, or cast you out, publicly, cruelly. Cruelly enough that you would flee south and never think to come back, because coming back north was death. Send you away, believing I had thrown you over for another woman, so that you would grieve, and hate me, and live." He spread his hands and they were shaking. "So, I did the arithmetic a king is cursed to do. I weighed your love against your life. And I stood in that hall and I said the cruelest words I have ever said, and I watched you walk into the snow, and I let you believe I had found you wanting, because a woman who believes she was thrown away does not come back to be killed." "Ilsa," she said. Her mouth was dry. "You married Ilsa?" "I betrothed myself to Ilsa," he said, "because the same man told me the betrothal was the price of your safety, that the pack would need a public reason, and a mate at my side would be reason enough, and he chose her himself. Your dearest friend, of every woman in the north. He said the wound had to cut deep enough that you would never once think to come back and test it. And what deeper wound was there in all the world than the 2 people you loved best, standing together on a dais without you? She was as much a pawn as either of us, Nerith. She wept the whole way through it. The betrothal dissolved within the year, quietly, once he no longer needed it, and she has lived in disgrace and guilt ever since. And neither of us was ever anything to the other but a knife the same hand was holding." Nerith stood very still. The archive was silent around them, 30 years of a kingdom's paper watching. "Who?" she said. "The southern man, the one who set all of it in motion. Give me his name." And Kaelin looked at her, and she watched him not want to say it, watched him understand exactly what it would do to her, and say it anyway, because he had run out of not yet. I never had his name, he said, only his face. Silver hair. Pale eyes, patient as a stone, a chancellor's ring. He held her gaze. He found me in the north 3 years ago and told me exactly how to break your heart so that you would run south. And then, I would wager my crown on it. He was waiting on that southern road when you came running. The floor went out from under her. The man who had pulled her from the ditch. The man who had told her he had searched for her longer than she had been alive. The man who put her on this throne and stood at her right shoulder for 3 years and steered her gaze forever from the north. Caldus, she whispered. He had not saved her from the cruelty. He had written it. He had broken her in the north with one hand and caught her in the south with the other and called it rescue, and she had knelt at his feet and thanked him for it for 3 years. She did not sleep. She walked the mended walls of Vera until the sky went gray, turning the last 3 years over in the new and terrible light, and every piece of it fit. The way Caldus had found her so precisely, in a ditch on an empty road, as though he had known the hour she would fall. The way he had raised her, quickly and completely, into exactly the kind of queen a chancellor could stand behind. The way he counted everything twice, except the one account that mattered, his own. By dawn she knew she had to be certain. And to be certain she had to hear it from the old man's own mouth. And to hear it she had to become, one last time, the grateful, moldable creature he believed he had made. She went to him in his study as the bells rang for morning. She let her face be stricken. It was not hard. She told him there had been another attempt. Poison at the feast, and she watched his pale eyes. And she saw the thing she had come to see. He was not surprised, not for the flicker of an instant. A man hearing for the first time that his queen had nearly been murdered at her own table does not receive it with the calm of a man crossing an item off a list. "My poor child," Caldus said, and rose and took her hands in his cold, dry ones. "I feared this. I have feared it since the northern king set foot in this hall." He steered her, gently, into a chair. "It is him, Nerith. It grieves me to say it, but you must hear it. Kaelin has come south not to save Drenmar, but to seize Vera through you. The attempts are his. He means to frighten you into his arms, to bind you to him, and when the alliance has made him master here, to be rid of you and rule a kingdom bought with your blood." He pressed her hands. "I have found proof. Letters. I will lay it before the envoys of Sorn at the summit tomorrow, but it cannot come from an old chancellor grasping at a rival crown. It must come from you, the queen herself, denouncing the man who wronged her. No one in that room will doubt a woman accusing the king, who once threw her away. And there it was, laid out, whole. He would use her wound, the very wound he had carved, to make her the blade that struck down the one man who knew the truth. He would set Vera and Drenmar at each other's throats before the arbiters of Sorn, and stand in the wreckage of both crowns as the only steady hand in the south. But he had made one small error, and Nerith, who could read a false ledger at 40 paces, caught it. "You said the poison was his doing," she said softly, keeping her face broken. "But I never told you it was poison, Chancellor. I said only that there had been an attempt." She watched the pale eyes flicker. "Just once. How did you know it was poison, unless you knew which cup, and which hand, and which feast?" For half a heartbeat, the old man's patient mask slipped, and underneath it, she saw at last the thing that had never been there in 3 years, not once. She had searched his face on the southern road for pity, and found none, and she had never understood why, and now she did. There was no pity in Caldus because there was no love in him, and never had been. She had been to him exactly what she had feared. She was to everyone who ever kept her, useful, a vessel of the old blood, a legitimacy to stand behind, a crown he could wear at one remove. He had not wanted her. He had wanted what she was for, the oldest wound in the world, and the same hand had cut it twice, Then the mask slid smoothly back into place, and Caldus smiled, his patient smile, and she understood that he did not yet know she had seen. "My mistake, child," he said easily. "Kaelin boasted of it to me himself, thinking me his friend in this. A poison," he said. "You see how brazen he has become." So he had recovered, and thought her still his. Good. She let the tears come, and they were not entirely counterfeit. "You are right," she said in a small voice. "Of course you are right. You have always looked after me." She lifted her chin as though gathering a broken courage. "I will do it. Tomorrow, before the envoys of Sorn, I will say what must be said." Caldus's eyes shone with satisfaction. "That is my queen," he murmured. She walked out of his study, steady and slow, and only when the door had closed behind her did she let her face go cold and clear and murderous. He wanted her to stand before 3 courts tomorrow and denounce a king. She would stand before 3 courts tomorrow. She would walk straight into the center of his trap, wearing the grateful face he had made for her. And then in front of the arbiters of Sornand, the whole of the north and south, she would turn it inside out and let the snare he had set 30 years ago close at last, on the hand that had set it. The summit convened at noon in the great stone hall, beneath the mended rafters where the feast had been. The envoys of Sorn sat as arbiters at the center, gray and neutral and watchful, come to weigh whether the alliance of Vyra and Drenmar was a peace or a threat to the south. Kaelin sat with his northern delegation, and did not know what she meant to do, and looked at her with a terrible, careful hope. Caldus stood at her right shoulder, where he had stood so long, certain of his puppet, waiting for her to loose the arrow he had fitted to her string. The eldest envoy of Sorn spread her hands. "Queen of Vyra," she said, "grave charges have been whispered against the king of Drenmar. Your chancellor tells us you yourself will speak to them. We will hear you." Every face in the hall turned to Nerith. Caldus, at her shoulder, went still with anticipation. Kaelin's jaw was set like a man awaiting a blow he had decided to accept without flinching. Nerith rose from the throne of Vyra. "I will speak to the charges," she said, and her voice carried clear to the cold corners of the stone. "There have been 3 attempts upon a life in this kingdom these past days. A bolt upon my eastern wall, a poison in a cup at my own feast. And 3 years ago a third, subtler than either, an attempt not upon my body but upon my whole life. Dressed up as a broken heart, she let the silence gather teeth. My chancellor has told me the hand behind them is the king of Drenmar. And I have come before the arbiters of Sorn to say plainly that my chancellor is a liar, and that the hand behind all 3 is his own." The hall erupted. Caldus went rigid beside her. "Majesty," he said, low and swift. "She is distraught. She has been worked upon by the northern king. 3 years ago," Nerith went on, over him louder, "a silver-haired southern man came to King Kaelin in the north. He is in this room." She turned and pointed, and 30 years of patience cracked in the old man's face. "He told the king that I was the lost heir of Vyra, and that 3 southern houses would kill me if I were claimed. He gave the king a choice. Cast me out cruelly enough to send me running south, or watch me die. And then he waited on the southern road, and pulled me from the ditch he himself had dug, and set me on this throne, grateful and blind, a vessel of the old blood for a chancellor to rule behind." She faced the envoys of Sorn. "Search his archive. Search the desk in his study. You will find the schedule of coin paid 3 years ago, and you will find the poisoner's mark, and you will find a false letter meant to hang a starving king. I have seen the first with my own eyes. I will wager my crown upon the rest." The eldest envoy of Sorn turned her gray gaze slowly upon Caldus. "A search," she said, "costs an honest man nothing." And Caldus, cornered at last, dropped the patience he had worn for 30 years, and Nerith saw the blade slide from his sleeve half a breath before he moved. He did not lunge for the envoys, or for the king. He lunged for her, the queen who had turned in his hand, and there was 30 years of thwarted arithmetic in it. But this was the one thing in all the world Nerith had never stopped knowing how to do. She did not scream. She did not recoil. She turned into him, the way a huntress turns into a charging thing, and caught the knife arm at the wrist, and used the old man's own weight against him, and put him down hard upon the cold stone floor of the hall he had ruled her from for so long. Her knee found the space between his shoulders. The blade skittered away across the flags, and she leaned down close to his ear, close enough that only he would hear it, and said the truest thing she had learned in 3 years of being remade. "You spent 3 years trying to make me forget I was ever a huntress," she said. "You should have tried harder." Then the guards had him, and hauled him up, and the great snare he had set before she was ever born, closed, finally, on nothing but himself. They dragged him from the hall, and the arbiters of Sorn rose to see the truth of her word confirmed in his archive, and it was, all of it, and by nightfall the thing was done. The realm was safe, the alliance stood, Drenmar would live, and Kaelin was cleared of everything, and free, at last, of the lie he had carried for 3 years. He came to her when the hall had emptied, when it was only the two of them beneath the mended rafters, and his face was open and wrecked and full of a hope, so large it hurt to look at. "You knew," he said. "You believed me. You saved all of it." He took a step toward her. "Nerith, the bond, it is real, it was always real, and now there is nothing left standing between us, nothing at all, and there it was." She could feel the bond, humming alive and warm and true, and every instinct she owned was leaning toward him, and she made herself stand still against the pull of it. "Knowing the truth," she said quietly, "does not undo 3 years of believing I was the sort of thing a person throws away." Her voice did not shake. It cost her everything to keep it from shaking. "You did it to save me. I understand that now. I even believe it was the only choice you were given, but understanding why I was thrown away is not the same as never having been thrown away. I have been made useful by every soul who ever kept me. Kaelin, you called us. Even the moon that bound us without asking, and I do not know yet how to walk toward a man wanting me. When the last time I let myself believe I was wanted, I woke up in the snow." "Nerith," he said. "I am glad you are alive," she said. "I am glad Drenmar will live. You will be a good king, better than they ever let you be." She turned for the doors, and her whole heart was screaming at her to turn back, and she did not. "But I cannot walk toward you tonight, not yet. Perhaps not ever. I have to learn to want something for no reason but wanting it, and I do not think I can learn that standing in your shadow." And Nerith, Queen of Era, walked the whole length of that hall by herself, past the man who had thrown her into the snow to save her and would have spent his life to keep her. And this time it was her choice, and the great doors closed behind her, and she left him standing alone beneath the rafters with everything true between them at last, and still, for now, not enough. He courted her through the long winter, and he did it in the open, where the whole of the South could see. The letters came first, 2 and 3 a week, carried the long cold road from Drenmar in his own hard hand. Some ran for pages, and some were 3 lines, and not all of them were even about her. A dispute over the northern passes, he wanted her clever opinion on, as though her honest judgment were still worth the asking, as though he wanted the whole of her mind and not merely the warmth of her. One read only. "I have no talent for the not yet anymore. I spent those years being certain and silent, and it cost me you. So here's a small, true thing with no schedule attached. I miss you at the treaty table. The kingdom is duller, and my clauses are worse." Wenna counted them. 40 by the turn of the year, she reported, with the grim satisfaction of a woman who disapproved and was keeping track anyway. Pell thought it was the most romantic thing in the history of either kingdom and said so often enough that Nerith threatened to post him to the border. She answered none of them. She told herself she was learning to want things for no reason, and that a woman cannot learn that with 40 letters a week, leaning on the scale. And then, One gray morning, near the deep of winter, the letters stopped. A last one came, shorter than any before it. Nerith, you have made yourself clear, and I have been a slow student, but I am learning. You do not owe me a single hour more of your grief. I will not write again. Be well and be wanted, by someone braver than I was. She read it 3 times, and it was exactly what she had asked for, and it sat in her chest like a stone, and she could not for her life understand why the getting of a thing she had wanted felt so precisely like losing. No more letters came. The bond stayed quiet where she kept it, closed and starved, and refused, no matter how she starved it, to fade. It was Pell who brought the news, gray-faced a fortnight later, with Wenna grim at his shoulder. "The King of Drenmar," he said, and had to stop. "He is gone, Majesty." Vanished from his own capital 4 nights past. No guard, no horse, no crown, his sword left on its stand. His court fears the worst. They fear a knife in the dark, a remnant of Caldus, a foreign hand. "And Majesty, they have sent to you, because—" Pell faltered, "because there is no one else who might find him." Nerith was on her feet without deciding to be. And she knew, the way she had known nothing else in her life, that there was one way left to find him, and that she had been strangling it shut for a season. She pressed her hand to her chest, over the bond she had kept starved and closed since the summit. "It is duty," she told herself. "He is a king, and a king is missing, and finding the lost is the one thing I have always known how to do." It was true. It was not the whole of the truth, and she had grown too honest for the rest. She opened the bond. It hit her like a shuttered door blown wide in a gale. Not danger. Not a knife, or a foreign hand, or the remnant of an old man's malice. Cold. Bone-deep, endless, patient cold. And beneath it a grief so vast and so quiet that it was almost peace, the grief of a man who has laid every weapon down. He was alive, he was freezing, and he was, she understood with a lurch, exactly where the bond was pulling her, south and east, down the old road out of the pass. She rode alone, as she had always insisted on going everywhere, and the bond hauled her forward like a rope through the falling snow, out of the mended kingdom and onto the empty southern road, until she came to a stretch of frozen ruts beneath an enormous gray sky, a place she knew in her bones. A half-dead huntress had lain down in the snow and waited to end, and there, in the very ruts where she had fallen, sat the King of Drenmar, no crown, no guard, no fine coat against the killing cold. He had stripped himself down to the same nothing she had worn the day he sent her away, and he was half frozen, and blue-lipped, and past shivering, and when he saw her ride out of the snow toward him, his ruined face broke open into something so glad it hurt to look at. "You found me," he said, and his voice was thick and slow with the cold. "You idiot," she said, and she was off the horse and dragging her cloak around him before she had finished the word. "You will die out here." "What in the name of the moon are you doing?" "Waiting," he said. His head lolled against her shoulder, and through the wide open bond, she felt the whole undefended truth of him pour through, with no mask left on it at all. "I could not court you with letters anymore. You said you had to learn to want a man, for no reason but wanting him, and I thought, how can she, when I am always the king, always the crown, always the man with the schedule and the shadow? So I put it all down." He gestured weakly at the empty snow, the missing crown, the abandoned sword a kingdom away. "I came to where you fell, so that, if you ever came, you would find nothing here that could keep you. Nothing but a cold and frightened man, with no throne, left to stand in front of you, wanting you for no reason at all except that none of it means anything if you are not there. 3 years ago I could not say the true thing," he murmured. "I swallowed it in that hall, and turned my face away and let you walk into the snow, and I have hated the coward who did that every day since. So I will say it now, with nothing left to lose, and no schedule, and no crown." He pulled back just enough to find her eyes, and his own were pale and stripped, and utterly without artifice, the man who hid everything, hiding nothing at all. Stay, not because you are the heir, or the queen, or my mate, or useful to a single soul alive. Stay because I have wanted you and only you since the first hunt, and I walked away once to keep you breathing, and I will never walk away again, not to save your life, not to save my own. He drew a ragged breath. That is the dare. Choose a man who has nothing, I dare you. And Nerith, who had spent 3 years learning to want things, for no reason but wanting them, looked at the freezing, crownless, undefended man in the ruts where she had fallen, and felt the bond blaze open wide and warm and true between them, and understood that she had at last learned the lesson. Because there was nothing here to be useful to. There was no throne, no schedule, no shadow. There was only him, wanting her, and her wanting him back. For no reason in all the world but that. She opened the bond the whole way and let him feel it hit him, the answering flood of it, 3 years of it, and she watched joy and disbelief and relief break across his blue-lipped face like a sunrise. Ask me again, she said, when we are warm, and you can feel your own hands, and I can be certain you will remember it. His frozen mouth curved, and you will say yes. She pressed a kiss to his cold forehead, and gathered the king of Drenmar up out of the snow that had nearly taken them both. And for the first time in 3 years, Nerith of Vyra felt herself smile with her whole heart. Get me home first, she said, and find out. In the end, it took him until spring. He asked her warm, and he asked her sober, and he asked her with his own 2 hands and his own whole heart and not a schedule in sight. He asked across the treaty table until Wenna threatened to resign in writing. He asked, on the mended wall, where a bolt had once buried itself in the timber. He asked badly and beautifully, and once with so many flowers that the guard-room smelled like a wedding for a week. And every time Nerith told him to ask again tomorrow, until one perfectly ordinary spring morning, she looked at the man grinning hopefully at her over breakfast, and she said yes. Both kingdoms came out for it. The north and the south together, the starving realm he had saved and the dying realm she had raised, bound now not by a schedule of coin, but by 2 people who had each walked away once and learned, the hard and frozen way, never to do it again. Ilsa came quietly from her long seclusion, and Nerith took the hands of the friend who had wept through her own coercion 3 years before, and forgave her, because they had both been knives in the same cold hand, and neither had ever chosen it. Caldus did not come. Caldus sat in a cell beneath the old fort of Vera, and would sit there until the arithmetic of his whole long life was paid. He cried during the vows. She had known he would. She had not quite meant to herself, but the bond gave her away, and he laughed at her through his own tears, and she stopped caring who saw. You walked away with someone else once, she said to him, after, when it was done, testing the old wound and finding it, at last, only a scar, and here you are. I walked away to keep you alive, he said, and I came back to keep myself alive, because it turns out, I cannot do the thing at all without you. He kissed her. I am never walking away from you again. No taking it back. Why would I let you, said Nerith, Queen of Vera, who had once lain down in the snow to die, and had risen instead to a throne he never saw coming. I am the one who found you freezing in a ditch, if you recall. Best thing that ever happened to me, the king concluded. For once, she did not argue.